Okay, guys, so first of all, definition of frequency. Frequency is just a formula. The frequency is always going to be 1 over the period. That's how we find the frequency. So if I tell you the period is pi, then what's the frequency going to be? Yeah, 1 over pi. Okay. A sinusoid is just a type of curve. It can actually be the sine or the cosine curve. The reason it can be the sine or the cosine curve is because I can take the cosine curve and turn it into a sine curve. I want you to think about this for a minute. Just kind of watch. I'm going to put in sine x, and I'm going to put in cosine x. I'm going to do a zoom trig so I can see them. So here's my sine curve, and here's my cosine curve. What could I do to the cosine curve? That's the one in bold. What could I do to it so it would be the same thing as the sine curve? Shift it to the right, how much? Not 1. What's this? Remember these points and how far apart they are in the x value? Pi over 2, right? So, okay, let's say if I just went with your 1 that you said. So you guys said shift it to the right 1. Let's look at it now. So here's our sine curve. If it was just a shift to the right 1, then it should go right over top of it. See how that's a little bit off? It's not going right over top of it. But if I go and if I make it pi over 2, which what's pi over 2 approximately? 1.57, yeah. So now if I graph, see how now our sine curve and the cosine curve just goes right over top of it. They're exactly the same thing now. Okay, so with that shift, we can make that happen. All right, so now let's look over at number 1. It says an alternating current generator, an AC generator, converts motion to electricity by generating sinusoidal voltage, assuming that there is no vertical offset in phase shift. Vertical offset means no shift up or down. Phase shift means no shift left or right. The voltage oscillates between negative 170 volts and positive 170 volts with a frequency of 60 hertz. Write and graph a sine model that gives the voltage V as a function of the time in seconds. All right. So a lot of times it helps people to make this chart to come up with the functions. It says that we have no phase shift, so we're going to be starting at 0. It tells me that the frequency is 60. If I know that this formula, that the frequency has to equal 1 divided by the period, and I know the frequency is 60, what's that going to make the period then? No, I cross multiply and I'm going to have the period times 60 equals 1. So then what's the period going to be? 1 over 60, right? And so then what do I do to that to actually make my table of values? Divide it by 4 or multiply it by 1/4. So then my next one would be 1 over 240. I have to add on another 1 over 240, which would make it 2 over 240. That's 1 over 120. Maybe I should just write it as 2 over 240. Add on another 1 over 240, and it's 3 over 240, and that's going to be 1 over 80. And adding on one more, I'm going to get 4 over 240, and that's going to be 1 over 60. And doesn't that make sense that that's where we should end since that's what the period is? And then it's going to be saying then that because it has to follow a sine model, and so it's going to have to go 0, and then reach its high point of 170, then it goes back to 0, then it reaches its low point, then it goes back to 0. So we're trying to come up with an equation for this. We want to write the sine model. Well, the sine model then would have to be f of x equals, or it's v, we're supposed to use v. V equals, okay, so do we know the a value? What's the a value? Amplitude, guys, what's the amplitude? 170, so it's going to be equals 170 sine. Okay, now I have to know then that 2 pi over b is going to equal the period, and the period was 1 over 60. So now we can cross multiply, and we're going to get b equals 2 pi times 60, so 120 pi. And then what are we supposed to use? Time. So that would be our function. Any questions on that? So that one's a little bit harder. That's going to be kind of like number 11 in your book. All right, let's go down. 2 is actually harder than 3 and 4, so let's go down to 3 first. So on number 3, we're trying to come up with a curve for this, a sine or cosine curve. So we've got our x and we've got our y. So our first point here that we are given is 0, negative 0.5. The next point we're given is 1.5. But what has to be right here? What's in between 0 and 1? 0.5. So right here we have to have 0.50, right? And then up here we have 1 and 0.5. And then what's this point going to be right here? 1.5 and 0. And then what about this point right here? Right. Okay, and so we've got this to go from. Our key points then are given to us. We've got to go backwards. So I want you guys to think about that for a minute. You've got to find all this stuff. You have to know, first of all, is it sine or cosine? Think about that. You have to know the a value. You have to know the b value. There's no C because there's no shift or left or right, and there's no D because it hasn't been shifted up or down. So see if you can figure that out on your own now. All right, guys, so what do you think? Anybody think they know it? Guys, look at A. Well, first of all, is it sine or cosine? It's cosine, isn't it? Because it's going like 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. So we know this much. If you write this much, you'll get a point just for knowing that it's cosine. Okay? Now, we want to figure out what A is. A is the distance from these zeros up or down. So what is that distance? 0.5. But the other thing we have to think about is, does this go in the normal cosine pattern? The normal cosine goes 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. That's not what this one's doing, so what does there have to be out in front of it? A negative, right? And then to find B, we know that the period is equal to 2 pi over B. So we know that what's the period here? How long is it taking to start repeating? 2. So I know the period is 2 over 2 pi equals 2 pi over B. Cross multiply, 2b equals 2 pi. And so what does B have to be then? Pi. And so it should be -0.5 cosine of pi x. How many people got that? All right, quite a few. Okay, let's go to number 4. Actually, let's do 5 first. 5 is easier than 4. Okay, so look at number 5. Everyone should be able to figure out number 5 pretty quickly. You may not even need to make a table to figure it out. You can make the table if you need it, but I bet you really don't have to have it. All right. Danielle, you think you got it? Okay. Do you know anything about it yet? Do you know if it's sine or cosine? It is cosine. Is there any change in the period? Okay, but the period means how long in the x direction for it to start repeating. See how it's just the same? So B is just going to be 1 then when that happens. If the period is 2 pi, guys, that means B is just 1, so I can just put an x here. I don't have any coefficient. What's going to go out in front, in the very front? Sebastian? And why is that? Right, because the amplitude is 3. So the only change we had on this one is that the amplitude was 3. Masha, what's wrong? Okay, our formula is that the period is equal to 2 pi over B. Well, in this case, from here to here, that's 1 period, and that's a distance of 2 pi. So my period 2 pi equals 2 pi over B. Wouldn't that mean the B has to be 1? Okay. Anybody else questions? All right. Let's go back now. I know we're skipping around a lot, but 4 was the hardest one. Let's go back to 2 now. Back to 2. Okay, guys, so looking at the period, it starts here, goes to here, goes to here. This would represent 1 period, what I've traced over top of there. Those represent our 5 key points. This point, that one, that one, that one, and that one. Devin, what's the first key point right here? What's that one? Kelly, what's the next key point right here? Okay. Now, by knowing that point, that's telling me how much we're going up every time. Okay? Because this is going to be the first evenly spaced x's that we have. So I'm going to add on another pi over 6. That's going to give me 2 pi over 6. But what does that reduce to? Pi over 3. So at my next point, what's the y value at that next point then? 0, right? I have to add on another pi over 6. That takes us up to 3 pi over 6. What's another name for 3 pi over 6? Pi over 2. And what is that y value right there at pi over 2? Negative 2. And then we go to our last value. I have to add on another pi over 6, which would make it 4 pi over 6. And what's that going to be then? 2 pi over 3. Okay, so those are our key points. So I can see right off that this is going to have to be a sine curve because it's going 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So it's got to be sine. So just by putting that, that's showing that I know something. Does anybody know anything else about this? Yeah, question. The amplitude would be 2, I agree. Right? What else? What else could we figure out? There's only one other thing to figure out. Bailey? It is 3. How did you figure that out?
Well, the period is 2 pi over 3, so you do 2 pi over 3 is 2 pi over b.
Right. So the period has to be 2 pi over b, and the period is given, right here, this tells us the period is 2 pi over 3, has to equal 2 pi over b. So yeah, obviously b is going to have to be 3. And that's it. There's no shift up or down. Okay? Is it getting easier? All right, now let's go back and do that tougher one, number 4. All right. The first thing I always like to do with these shifts is I like to find the middle of these. So what's in the middle of 1 and 5? 3. I like to go like this. Because really that's like my new axis. It's called the sinusoidal axis. It's basically just our shift up or down. That's what that is. Okay? Now we need to know this point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can use those 5 points. So this first point then is 0, 3. My next point is 1, 1. This point would be, okay, that's a distance of 1, so 2, 3. Add on another 1, I go to 3, 5. Add on another 1, I'm at 4, and that would be back down at 3 again. Questions on how I got those points? All right, so now I'm going to decide, is this sine or cosine? I can look at that. Look at the pattern, guys. For sine, the first, third, and fifth have to be the same. For cosine, the second and the fourth have to be the same. So which one is it? Sine. So we know it has to be y equals sine. All right, now I want to find my amplitude. My amplitude is just the difference between all of these y values. It tells me my vertical stretch. So what is this then? What's the difference between all those? 2. But something we have to think about. Sine is supposed to go 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. This is going 0. It's going the opposite direction. So what do I have to put in front of the 2? A negative. Good. The next thing I have to find is I'll find my b value. What's the period here, guys? 4. So I know 4 has to equal 2 pi over b. So I'm going to cross multiply. I get 4b equals 2 pi. I divide by 4, and what do we get? Pi over 2. x, okay? Now, these were supposed to be zeros, but they're not. They're 3s. Okay, and so what does that mean? What happened? It's been shifted up 3. Okay, make sure you don't put that in parentheses. What if that had been in parentheses? Then what would it have meant? A shift to the left 3, and that's not what we want. Okay, good. We're going to save these 2 word problems until you have a chance to practice this a little bit, because you have to be able to do this pretty well before these will be doable. All right, so get out your book, page 510.